Howdy and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the reading that you did last week called Place, an Experiential Perspective by Yi-Fu Tuan. Tuan is a noted geographer who talks a lot about place and is an authority on place. And this is an earlier work of his that really gives us kind of a good framework with which to look at place. Now, geographers talk about place in a little different way than architects, but we're getting at the same thing. We're just approaching it from the viewpoint of dissecting it, which is what geographers are really good at, and architects who are really good at creating places. But we need to learn what makes a good place so that as architects we can recreate those in new works. So first off are the couple of different ways that you can talk about place and ways you can think about place. Place can be thought about as location or place as a unique artifact. So place as location, where this place is, located in several different ways, or place as a unique artifact, where place is a finding of yourself or an object. So if you think of an object on a table and describing the object as a unique artifact, artifact's just a fancy word for object. But these two different ways, place as a location, which has to do with coordinates and actually finding the space itself, not necessarily what the qualities of the place are, and then looking at place as a unique artifact where you are finding or understanding the place yourself and doing it through an experiential way. So first off, there's place as location. Place as location. So if you think about Austin, it can be found in central Texas. It's in the Edwards Plateau, on the edge of the Edwards Plateau in the I-35 corridor. It's located within Travis County, the state of Texas, United States, etc., etc. It's got geographic coordinates, GPS coordinates, so you can find it from space. The X, Y, and Z axis will locate where Austin is in the world and in space itself. And it's simply a unit within a larger hierarchy of space. So a place is some place that you can inhabit, but it has a very specific location. This way of describing it is very simple. It's very clear. You say, go up I-35 to exit 257, and that's Austin. So you know where Austin is located. But it's also a very abstract way of understanding location. It's not a direct method, so you're not actually there describing what is happening in a qualitative sort of way, but you're using map coordinates. You're using abstract ways of locating and knowing where something is. And that's all maps are an abstract representation of a real space. Now, place as unique artifact. So again, think of an artifact as just an object, something that's sitting on the table and you're describing. It's very descriptive. It has to do with color. It has to do with physical qualities of stature, proportion, balance, rhythm, all those things that go into making up some sort of spatial composition. But it's also very experiential in terms of it depends on who you are and how you are looking at the space. It depends on what's in the space. If you think about Austin and the Keep Austin Weird sort of moniker, the people in Austin, the events of Austin are what create how we think about Austin as a unique artifact or as a thing that is sitting in the world. It's a very complex way of understanding what's going on. It's not as simple as just driving down the highway and getting off at a certain exit. If you want to know where Austin is as a unique artifact, you have to understand its history, you have to understand its culture, you have to know what the events are that are going on now, you have to know what's being planned in the future. All of those things go into describing a place, such as Austin, as something that is unique, as something that is a thing in and of itself. Now, in order to do this, you really have to learn about it by living in it. It's hard to do this, maybe impossible to do this from afar. You can't do this from San Antonio. You can't sit in San Antonio and know Austin. You have to be in Austin in order to understand the place as a unique artifact. Now, now this sort of way of looking at it starts to get very philosophical, starts to get very theoretical. Basically, it just means we're thinking about it. Thinking about place as a location, there's no real thought except, hey, I want to go there and this is where it's located. If you want to think about what Austin is or what a place is, then you have to get into some sort of experiential mode where you start thinking about what's going on, but you do it in such a way that is systematic so that you can apply it to other places, you can compare it to other places, and it becomes a way of thinking. The two are not mutually exclusive. You can think about a place through very personal experiences, but you can also extend those and compare those to other places, even though you haven't necessarily personally been there, although that really helps. But you can still be philosophical and you can still think about what's going on and apply these to other situations. So what we're doing here in this class, the way I've set up the semester, is that we're going to be learning about remote places in history. So those are remote places in time, they're remote places geographically. We're not going to be able to travel to Egypt or England or any of those fun places, except through pictures and except through thinking about them, reading about them, and talking about them. But that becomes a very abstract thing. You can't sit in San Antonio and know what Austin is, experientially anyway. So what I'm trying to do is I'm going to be having you look at places here in Austin that start to embody some of those ideas of places that are remote, that are going to be talked about in a more abstract way that we can't actually visit. So my hope is that you connect the two places, and the things that you learn about the historic places you can see in places today in a contemporary setting that you can personally experience, and then maybe that personal experience will relate to those historical sites, and you can gain a little bit more understanding than just what you get from reading about them in a book, and actually feel maybe some of what those places are like, even though you haven't been to them. So place as experience, where you are experiencing what it's like to be there, visually, through sound, through all your senses, is a very important component of knowing what a place is. So there are two ways of knowing through experience, and those are passive and direct modes of knowing. Very simply, this has to do with your senses. Senses are broken up into passive and active senses. For passive senses, there's taste, smell, and touch. The example that's given in the reading has to do with a wine taster who is said to think about wine through an educated palate. So through tasting, you're actually thinking about what the wine is. Now, the thing is with these passive sensory experiences, um, these experiences have no public existence. In other words, other people can't know what you are tasting or smelling or touching. It is only through that personal kind of direct engagement with the world that you can have these experiences. So nobody else can really taste what you're tasting. Now, another way to think about things is that this passive sensory experience is actually locked inside the receiver, locked inside the woman who is tasting the wine. So with the passive sensing, the what do you smell, what do you taste, those things are ways of knowing, but not necessarily ways of sharing what you know. These are all ways of thinking through sensitive fingers, through sensitive palates, but it's not a good way of sharing what you're knowing. So the other way is through active sensory experiences. So these are seeing and hearing, which are things that can be presented to the public, to others, in pictures and sounds. So this is a very good way for communicating what a place is like, as well as understanding it through these senses. So seeing is really thinking. Our last reading, How to See, was an introduction into the importance of being able to decode the visual environment. We can learn a lot from just looking at things, but it's also a way of thinking about things. It is a way of understanding patterns. It is a way of understanding reality itself. This is an airline traffic map or diagram that shows the relationship of hub cities in the United States for major airlines. You get a sense for the density of flight, for which cities are more important than others, and kind of an overall understanding of how things move about the country in the air. And here's another example of flights, this time looking at the entire world and how the United States is connected to Europe and to Asia and to Africa, South America. And you can just see through these patterns that the eastern U.S. Has a lot of activity and is connected mainly to Europe. There's a really strong pattern of movement back and forth between these two areas of the globe. Not so much to other places, even though there are big hubs of activity in Hong Kong and Singapore and in the Middle East. But just looking at how these patterns are presented visually, we get a real strong understanding that the U.S. and Europe are really tied closely together. These are wind patterns of the U.S. So these maps are created through data. So you've got data points from all over the country that are combined into a visual representation of what's going on. And this really helps us understand better through this visual communication, this data visualization of how wind is moving throughout the United States. Much easier way of looking at it than looking at data points or more abstract ways of knowing things. This visual communication happens very directly, and we're actually pretty good at it, of seeing what the patterns are and how wind moves around the country. We can also apply this sort of visual understanding through just looking at the world, through looking at how a hillside town is organized in Italy, for instance. You can start to understand where the major streets are. You can understand the different building types, looking at how residential areas are situated with maybe more commercial and higher density activities, all simply from kind of looking at the patterns of what's going on with the city. Now, if you represent those visually in some sort of map or diagram, you can even see the patterns better than just looking at the actual thing itself. So this shows different ways of organizing neighborhoods or cities according to the patterns of the streets. So all the way from gridiron up to lollipops on a stick are different ways of dividing up the world, different way of organizing land and space that all have different consequences, as well as ways of shaping how we view and use these spaces. So for instance, looking at the number of intersections, that might tell you what the flexibility level is of any particular pattern of organizing the streets. The gridiron has lots of intersections at a regularly spaced interval. So that would imply that it's really easy to move around this area. You have choices of ways to go. So if one street is blocked, there's probably another street just a block over that may not be. And so this is a very flexible, um, very easy way of organizing space that's also understandable. And then kind of as you move down the line of the different intersections that are involved in these different ways of dividing up land, you get to lollipops on a stick, and there aren't very many choices. There aren't very many ways that you can move around the city if it's organized this way. So that starts to tell you something about how our view of cities and living in cities has changed from 1900, say, to 1980 with these lollipops on a stick. Um, we're much more dedicated now to the automobile, and so distances and flexibility is not as valued as it was back with the gridiron, where most people were walking around, or maybe had slower modes of transport, where it was more important to be able to quickly get from one place to another with a slow means versus 1980s, where it's assumed everybody's in a car. And so it doesn't really matter if you have to drive several blocks in order to take a left to drive several blocks to get back to a place that maybe as the crow flies is actually very close. Patterns can also be applied to things like university campuses. Looking at how buildings are organized, how they relate to each other, knowing what the different departments are and maybe how those relate to central administration buildings tells you something about the campus and about the university itself. You can also apply this sort of pattern recognition by looking at buildings, which we'll do a lot this semester, obviously. But looking at buildings in terms of circulation, hierarchy, how it relates to natural light, how the building is just massed in general, how individual units relate to the whole, are all ways of understanding what's going on with the building and how the events, how people are using the building, and how the people are actually relating to what's happening with the building. So all these patterns are accessible through visual means. It is a way of understanding more directly what's going on. Now, place is a center of meaning that's constructed by experience. So even though theory and abstract means, so location and being able to talk about systematic ways of comparing places are important, it's also important to add in this experiential way of knowing. So, things down to like distinct odors. Now, New York City may smell different than Austin, or it does smell different than Austin. Lubbock smells different than Dallas. Knowing what goes into those factors and why it smells different and how you experience it differently are all ways of constructing an idea of space through these experiences, very personalized sensory experiences. So other things like textures and the visual qualities, and even down to seasonal changes in temperatures in a place become really important. A garden wall, for instance, may be a really bad place to sit in the summer in a particular garden because the sunlight hits it and warms it up, so it's not really comfortable to sit next to when it's 100 degrees outside. But in winter, it's just the opposite. That may be the best place to sit because it does get sun, because the mass of the wall, maybe it's stone, re-radiates that heat and creates a really nice environment, a microenvironment responding to seasonal changes in temperature. So even knowing things like that about a place help you construct ideas of what place are and what makes a good place or a bad place. These experiences can happen at different scales, all the way from furniture and a fireplace through home and up to the globe and the universe. But they all have their own center of meaning. They've all got this meaning that is constructed by experience that you have in the space. And kind of an aside, talking about scale, there's a little film called Powers of 10 that was made by Charles and Ray Eames, who are very famous architects and designers back in the 60s, I believe, that talk about kind of the different scales of the universe and how we relate to other scales throughout the world and the universe. So it just kind of puts a perspective on what our individual lives and experiences are in comparison to very large things like universes, and then also very small things like atoms and electrons. So if you go to the YouTube link, it's about a 10-minute film, and it's a really famous film in design and in the world as a really good way of understanding different scale. So the different scales are important when you're talking about place. Scale has a direct bearing on how closely we can relate to the space experientially. So starting with the fireplace, starting with furniture where you have a very individualized small space that creates a sense of place. The center of meaning for the family is the hearth. In English usage, hearth means home. This is the place of gathering. This was the important place for warmth, for cooking, for gathering and sharing and talking, creating bonds in a family. It's a very intimate space. It's a very important space. Maybe not so much now because of the way we live and because of how homes are constructed with central air and central heating, but it's still a very symbolic center of the home and is what people think of when they think of a home situation. Looking at the level of furniture, this is a dining table by Charles René Mackintosh, a Scottish architect. The level of this table can be a place in and of itself, and even inside of a dining room. The table has very particular physical characteristics, and the events that happen at this table can create a sense of place in this very small, intimate area of a dining table. The bed is another very important kind of individual-sized experience. Happiness is to sleep in one's own bed. Each day it is a point of departure and of return. These sorts of places are known intimately and subconsciously, and they must be brought to the surface to study and truly understand. So these everyday things, like the place of the bed, is something that you don't go around thinking about every day. But if you bring it to the forefront, if you start to study it and understand how you relate to it, then you have a much better chance, if you're going to be an architect, of creating places that maybe do similar things or maybe do very different things. But you have to bring them to the forefront and study them in order to understand fully and be able to use that information. And so the home itself is a nurturing shelter. That's the primary meaning of what a home is. This particular house is by Mies van der Rohe, a modern architect, and it shows how he thought about how the house related to the rest of the world. It's raised up on a plinth. It's separate from the context of the lawn and of the rest of the world, and kind of sets its own datum line in the world that everything else has to respond to. And so the house becomes the central way of organizing and relating to the world. It becomes a pivot point, as Tuan says, for shelter, for return, for privacy, for life processes, for even feeling, and maybe most importantly, feeling, because house is what frames all of our everyday activities and really tells us, how we can relate to other things, to other people, to family, to the public. It's embodied with all of these meanings because it is so closely associated and intimately linked with our everyday. And so the home can be experienced through passive means like smell and taste and touch. But there are also those internal feelings that are much harder to express. The more personal and the more internal the feeling, the harder it is to express. It becomes an ineffable quality, something that can't be explained easily because it is so personal. And when you do try to explain it, when you do try to publicly say, how you feel about a place or something, it starts to lose its ability to transfer meaning, and so it withers under the public glare. It's something that other people can't relate to because they haven't experienced what you've experienced in that place. But the home is also a visual object. It is simply an object like anything else that can be understood and decoded, just like we learn to do in how to see, or start to think about in how to see. So at the city level, um, these these places are really the best example and the best means of understanding place because we relate to cities as places. We may not relate to our homes as places because they are so intimate to us, but the city itself, the city takes on certain characteristics that are really about place and really give us an understanding of what place means. Um, One way. Um, there was a group of um, people in France in the late 1960s that formed the Situationists International, which was a group that looked at the city as a collection of experiences and mapped the city in a way that had to do with how people personally lived in the city, attended events, had things happen to them, had meaningful moments, and created city maps that tried to relate this very personal, intimate experience, which is very difficult to do. They were attempting to do it through maps, which was kind of interesting. And so, if we look at rocking chairs, and you look at a map showing the distribution of rocking chairs per individual, maybe a map something like this where you try to understand a city through how many rocking chairs it has, it doesn't really make much sense. The rocking chairs don't directly map onto people and personal experiences, even though it's kind of an interesting way of looking at the world. Um, so cities have their own very distinct places that help create the larger sense of place in a city. Rockefeller Center in New York City is one of those, where it's a place that changes between summer and winter and holiday seasonal settings, that becomes a lot about what the place of the city is and what it's all about. And so you can relate to these as kind of combinations of places in a city that create the idea of a city as a place as a whole. Vatican City is another example of these very localized experiences that, that start to give us a way of understanding what's happening in the world. Now, when you look at something like the countryside, these places tend to really stick in our minds because of the scale of what's going on. In the countryside, there's generally a very isolated view of something. There's a lot of emptiness. There's a lot of context and a lot of ground for very particular peak experiences, as Tuan says. And that's why they become so memorable and so distinctive, because there's not a whole lot going on like there is in a city, but they're very unique, unusual, and singular experiences that are easy to remember. You capture with a single photograph what's going on in this place in your mind, and it's a lot easier to remember versus cities where there's so much going on that it becomes difficult to really keep up and say what a city is in particular, because it's a combination of so many things. So cities are definitely places of meaning. Each city has its own personality, its own characteristics that are very definite and very different from other cities. And it's all because of the meaning that's embodied in the people and the events and the places within the city and how they relate to each other and how the individual relates to those. Cities warrant a lot of attention in maps, unlike individual places like rocking chairs. Cities are at the scale where maps make a lot of sense, where you can map neighborhoods, where you can map streets. You can map things that tell you a lot about how things are organized, whereas trying to map rocking chairs would be completely impossible and wouldn't tell you much anyway. The view of the wilderness is complex, having to do with these kind of peak experiences versus the frustrations of and the common occurrences of things in the city, things in our everyday household, things in our everyday life tend to be experienced differently because they aren't isolated, because it's more about a buildup of many things, not about that singular sort of vision of the red barn out in the wilderness. Common consents are thought of as places worthy of naming. And so if a group of people think a particular valley is important, they will name it. If they think a particular intersection or neighborhood is important, they will name it. And it comes through a common consent. It takes several people to say, yeah, I think that's what we want to call it, because it has some sort of meaning, and calling it something in particular is appropriate because all of us have decided that that's the way it is. Whereas empty places are thought of in neutral terms of space and area. So places get particular names, where empty spaces are talked about as space and area. So if you talk about Area 51, even though it's a very particular space, it's more of an area because it is not something that we experience. We can't really talk about it. So that's just kind of an interesting example of how we use the term place, space, area as ways of communicating how we think about that and the importance of that place. So when we look at neighborhoods and regions, these things are a little different. We relate to them a little differently. Neighborhoods tend to lack the visual and conceptual prominence that maybe individual objects have. It's really tough to know where a neighborhood is. Now, this map of Manhattan kind of very clearly and succinctly says that this is Midtown and this is Midtown South, and here's the dividing line at 34th Street. But in reality, the difference between 35th Street and 33rd Street isn't as clear-cut as this map kind of leads us to believe. There's no sudden change in what's going on in the neighborhood necessarily that shows where that boundary is. And so neighborhoods lack those sharp, physically defined boundaries, and they really have no distinct skylines like a city does that sets it apart from other neighborhoods. But there's obviously a lot that goes on in the neighborhood that gives it its character, and gives you an understanding of what's going on. So when you look at the skyline of New York City, you go, well, that's New York. But if you look at particular parts of it, you don't necessarily say, well, that's this Midtown neighborhood, this is Soho, etc. You can, to a certain extent, probably more so in New York City, because um, even the individual areas have more of a distinct skyline, but it's still part of a whole, and those boundary lines are not really clear. So neighborhoods have blurry boundaries. It's hard to determine which particular street separates one from the other, because things kind of ease and change throughout several streets, and aren't as clear cut as maybe that Manhattan map led us to believe. Neighborhoods are usually thought about more by sociologists and planners than they are by the inhabitants. Some neighborhood groups, neighborhood organizations are very strong and relate very closely to particular neighborhoods, but still those boundaries are blurry, and are kind of more useful to a larger viewpoint, which sociologists and planners tend to use. Neighborhoods can be distinguished by ethnic, socioeconomic status, look, and feel of houses and streets. So you move through a neighborhood, and the houses and streets and character changes, but again, it's not a hard and fast boundary. It's more of a blurred experience. Residents themselves may not always be aware of the defining characteristics. They may not be able to describe, well, our street is all about the trees, and about cars parked on it, and those sorts of things make up what our neighborhood is all about. And again, by starting to decode visually, and starting to talk about and study these things, we can become more aware of what's going on, and understand neighborhoods kind of removed from the everyday experience of residents. The distinctive parts are not always publicly accessible. They rely on time and experience, and grow imperceptibly. So this is one of those things where you have to live in a place in order to fully understand what's going on. So it may be that hawks fly by at 5 p.m. every night, and that's an important part of the neighborhood. But if you're not there at 5, you'll never experience that. And so you have to be there over time. You have to feel the seasons change. You have to see the hawks come and go in order to get a feel of the neighborhood. Down to things like the mailman, and how the mailman makes his rounds. All those very distinctive parts are not always accessible by people who are just driving by the neighborhood. Now, regions are really too large to be perceptible. If you think about the Paris Basin, or the Midwest U.S., you know where it is. It has a definite location, but you don't necessarily know that you're a part of it, or know when you move in and out of it, because it is so large. There's no single profile or border visible to these regions. You don't move from like central Texas to North Texas in any sort of really well-defined way, that has you in one at one moment, and in another in the next moment. But regional consciousnesses are shared feelings that are developed over time, and they're developed through commonalities like weather, the type of work, even just the smell in the air. And so people from the Midwest have a certain sensibility because of the region that they're in, and you can point to them and you can say they're Midwesterners, because they have this shared experience and react to it in a similar way. The regions are too large to be known directly. You can't just plop down and take a whiff and say, I understand everything that's going on here. You have to kind of zoom out to that abstract level, to that location level, and start to gather information beyond just your direct sensory means, in order to understand what the region is about. You have to know what the industry is. You have to know what the land is like. You have to know what groups of people are in the region, and things that you can't necessarily know directly about every part of that region. And then regions are largely constructed by symbolic means. So just like nations, it's more about rallying around a particular thing in the region. I always think about Green Bay and the Green Bay Packers as kind of a symbolic gathering of people in that area of Wisconsin. And so the cheesehead becomes kind of a symbol of people from that area and ways that we may relate to them. So at the national level, it becomes even more difficult to directly understand it. In fact, it becomes impossible even. This becomes a highly symbolic thing that we have to grapple with. Um, our understanding of the entire nation is something that is kind of a collective agreement, but it's also still personalized, and it also depends on where you are and how you relate to the rest of it. So U.S. maps, according to different parts of the nation, are always interesting because it gives us an insight into what the people of those regions think about their relationship to the rest of the nation. And of course, Texans, this is the way we generally think about the United States. Um, this may be a far too accurate representation of how we think. But the flags, become very symbolic and represent nations, but they also represent the idea of nation. So it just gives a symbolic thing that we can rally around um, to become united, that go way beyond anything that we experience at the city level, the region level, um, especially in places like the U.S. that have such diversity and so many different things going on, that if you start to try to relate cities to the nation, there's a very complex relationship there, and don't always necessarily embody what is going on nationally at the larger level. And you can't do it down to the neighborhood or to the individual house or to an individual piece of furniture or the hearth, because there's so many different individualized experiences that go into that. The nation isn't tied directly to those things, or isn't tied to direct things like our experiences, but they have to be direct. They have to be connected through symbolic means. So a nation is too big to know on an everyday level. You can't experience it on that direct level of knowing what a nation smells like. It's an abstract thing that's separate from those very personal sensorial experiences. National consciousnesses are raised symbolically over time. So it has to do with a passing of history, having some sort of shared consciousness that is built up through events, through deciding things, through a collective consciousness. It's not an individual thing that somebody decides what a nation is. And then nations are known conceptually through abstract things like flags and anthems, uniforms, ceremonies, geography. It becomes an idea. A nation is a collection of people, but they're collected around an idea, around a way of operating in the world that comes from this consciousness that's created over time. And nations can actually come and go more easily than cities. Cities have an inherent connectedness to place and therefore people, because people can relate to them, and it's not this abstract symbolic relationship that nations have. And then we come to visibility. How easy are these things to decode, like from the reading how to see? The passive experiences that you have are ones that are really deeply felt. They become part of you. They become part of your memory. and they become part of who you are. But they're often, really difficult to talk about. In fact, the more deep the feeling, the harder it is to talk about. That's why there are so many love poems and love songs in the world, because love is a very deeply felt thing, but it's very hard to express, and nobody has really nailed all of it because it's a very complex, very deep thing. But to know a place in the full sense of knowing requires participation by the discerning eye and mind. It's not something that you can passively get. You can walk into a place and feel what is going on, but unless you pay attention to it, unless you really look and you really think about what's going on, you're not going to understand, and you're not going to get the full deep meaning of it, and make it a part of you, and make it a part of your memories and experience that affect you. And so when you look at places, when you go to places, just stop and actually see what is going on, and you'll start to understand what makes a place. You'll start to see the textures. You'll start to see the different elements and how they relate to each other, the scale, the proportion, how rhythm and balance starts to create a certain feeling in a place, how different objects like benches or chairs suggested habitation, and how those can really become part of what the place is, even though there are no people in it necessarily. So the visibility of places, again, deeply felt but hard to articulate. You can really get a profound sense of place, but have a difficult time expressing that. You can't necessarily just show photographs in a slideshow of the place that you went to and communicate exactly what it was like to be in that place. It's completely impossible. So those sort of omnipresent components of ambient sounds and smells, the air movement, the soft soil and hard ground, happy accidents and blows of fate, are all things that go into making up what a place is, and are all things that you can't necessarily take a picture of and get the feeling that you get when you're actually there. So that passive experience, that inchoate or not fully formed feeling, must be given shape and visibility. You have to somehow use the photograph, use a diagram, describe it in a way that you can start to give it a shape that can be understood by others, so that they too can understand significance. But you're not going to ever be able to fully communicate those things which are most deeply felt. And so the role of art and education and politics are all other ways of trying to understand and create place, and become part of the, I guess, total picture of how we think about the world. And so experience itself takes time. It's something that you can't just walk into and understand a place experientially right away. It's something you have to live. It's something you have to visit several times in order to create a fully formed, complete picture of what a place is. Things like the colors, the movement of the sun, the comings and goings of people, all change the way we think about a place and go into creating that sense of place. So experience, it takes time. You can't instantly know it. It's something that's rarely acquired in passing, and you really have to think about it and look for it in order to create a catalog of those experiences you can use. Abstract knowledge is easy to learn. You can look at a map and understand where Austin is, but it remains an object out there in the wilderness until you go and directly experience it and understand what it means, to be weird in Austin. And then, a passing thought that a long life does not guarantee wisdom. A long chronological past for cities, for nations, for any places isn't necessary to actually make a great place. And so even though something is around for a long time, it's not necessarily a great place to be, just as a long life does not guarantee wisdom in people. So to recap a bit, space, very abstract. The way we chop up and divide the landscape is a very kind of arbitrary, abstract thing that exists really only in our minds. These quadrant sections, 41N-5E, those lines are not drawn out there. It's not shaded blue when you actually take a left off of 55 headed north. It's just a way of organizing space. But spaces and places start to become very meaningful in ways that directly relate to us. Place is something that is created by human beings for human beings. So some place like Pike's Market is a place where tourists go in order to understand Seattle better. It is a place that was created for a certain activity, and because of the way that activity of selling vegetables and fish in particular becomes a way of knowing the city, becomes a way of understanding the sensibilities of the place, and how that space has become much more than just a space. It's become a place of human activity, of human understanding. Same thing with the Golden Gate Bridge. It's not just a bridge. It's not something that just crosses the bay. It's something that defines what the place of San Francisco is. But to think about space, space and not place is what has driven Americans to the frontier, looking for more land, more room, more raw materials. All has to do with space. It's not about place, because there was no place yet, because place hadn't been created by humans for humans yet. Space is an abstract thing. It's without content. It is the physical bounds of something, but it's broad, it's open, it's empty, and in the end begs to be filled with something. Whereas place is past and present at the same time. It is stability and achievement. It is something that has been created by human beings for human beings over time, becomes an amalgamation of what has happened, what will happen, indications of the things that remain, that continue, that have the stability, that build up an idea that goes beyond just the space itself. A place has to be lived in. You can't have a place without human beings. You can't have a place out in the middle of nowhere unless there is some sort of inhabitation of it in order to make it a place. A place can happen at all scales. It's a construct of experience. It's really hard to have a place the size of a nation, but you can have places that are the size of, the Grand Canyon or something like that, because it's all constructed of the experience of being someplace in particular, whether it's large or small. And then places are sustained by the quality of human awareness. If you don't know it's a place, it probably isn't a place. You have to be aware of what's going on in order to construct that idea of place in your mind, for it to linger and for it to become an actual thing. So place at all scales, from the armchair to the nation, is a construct of experience. It is not sustained. It is sustained not only by timber, concrete, and highways, but also by the quality of human awareness. This is the San Jose Hotel on South Congress, one of the best places, I think, in town. It is something um, that speaks about inhabitation in a certain way. It creates an atmosphere. It is memorable. It is talked about by others. I'm talking about it right now. It becomes part of the consciousness that we share and part of the construct of not only this particular place, but of the city of Austin as well. So I hope you found some touch points in this reading that start to help you understand how we think about place and how it's constructed. Um, we'll obviously continue this discussion through the semester, but we're going to shift to some very particular ways of thinking about place to act as a framework for looking at the bulk of our content this semester, which are historical places and are places that we are still talking about now for various reasons. Um, so hopefully by thinking about history in terms of place, this becomes that systematic approach of a philosophical or thinking theoretical way of comparing different spaces to others in terms of place and understanding of meaning and how we relate to what is going on there.